Tonight we're hosting the Emergency Roundtable on the Human Rights Crisis in Burma. But before we get started, I want to mention that the Peace and Justice Task Force and Racial Justice Initiative, which are groups here at All Souls, have worked collaboratively on the issues of mass incarceration this year. We started with the Unitarian Universalist Common Reading of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. March 18th, we'll be holding an event on solitary confinement. A flyer is on the table in the back of the room. Please add your contact information to our sign-in sheet so you can learn about future events. Tonight's emergency program on Burma is sponsored by the Burma Task Force USA and the Unitarian Universalist United Nations Office. Our moderator this evening is Adam Carroll, who will explain the format.
I was glad to give you a hand. I hope your hand is healing, Linda. I really appreciate this series that Peace and Justice Task Force runs. I am the New York office director of Burma Task Force USA, which is made up of various national Muslim groups. We tend to focus a bit on the faith aspect of this, but this human rights crisis in Burma is very complex with economic aspects, with ethnic tensions. There's 135 ethnic groups, I believe. It's enormous, and so while we do work to raise awareness about the persecution of the Rohingya ethnic group, we acknowledge that the Karen and many other ethnic groups and religious groups are having a hard time. As Burma opens up to reform, perhaps, to globalization and to international investment, certainly, the growing pains are sometimes quite shocking to see, of mob violence to the government policies, both entrenched since the 1980s and more recent protocols and procedures. So we're very concerned about the direction of U.S. policy and international policy regarding Burma. We have experts here on the panel who know a lot more about this than I do, and who have been working for a long time on these human rights issues. So again, on behalf of all the groups that our Burma Task Force USA represents, I really want to appreciate the panel turning out for this exchange. I hope that today we will have go from what is happening, why is it happening, to what can we do. But we need to fully examine both the massacres of 2013 and before, as well as the legacy of oppression and rights restriction. Just this week, there was new revelations about leaked documents from the government that show that how this is orchestrated by the government of Myanmar with Burma. So we will get to that as well. So I hope that today you will be able to touch on many aspects of this.
One representative from Ne San U is from Burma, and he is a Muslim. Next to him, we have a Buddhist from Tricycle magazine, which is a very well-respected American Buddhist magazine, and he's written on this issue. We have Rachel Wagley from U.S. Campaign for Burma, and that's the poster for that wonderful organization behind her in Burmese language. Do you see it? It's on the thing there. Yeah. Bruce Knotts is executive director of the Unitarian Universalist Office at the United Nations, as you probably many of you know, and it has had a long career in the diplomatic service.
I'm Rachel. I'm with U.S. Campaign for Burma. We're a lobbyist organization down in D.C., and we take the evidence and the reports that other organizations like, am I louder? We take the reports and the evidence that organizations on the ground do, and we use them to advocate for policy changes down in DC. And I'm really glad that you all came out tonight, and really what we're about is just spreading the word and increasing awareness about what's going on there. And I think the current narrative about Burma is that the government has reformed and now we have a quasi-democratic state. But what is in fact the reality is that only less than 7% of parliamentarians were democratically elected, and the rest of parliament remains the same. And government leadership also remains the same. They've taken off their military clothing and are now wearing civilian garb, but they're the same exact people. And we're seeing the same exact patterns of violence and systems of impunity that we saw under the regime. Lately, I don't know how many of you have actually encountered this in the news, but who's read a news article about some of the anti-Muslim massacres and violent events that have occurred in Burma over the past year and a half? Yeah, so not everybody. Just to throw out a few numbers about what's going on, since June 2012, when some of the biggest violent events occurred, 200,000 Rohingya people have fled their homes. And this is all in Arakan state, which again is in the western part of Burma, bordering Bangladesh. And the two townships there on the westernmost part of Burma are predominantly Rohingya Muslim. And this has been the site of many of the detentions and killings and extrajudicial rapes and sexual violence that have occurred over the past year and a half. And what I want to talk about today is that there are numerous factors that's both allowing this violence to occur and then allowing this violence to continue. And Buddhist nationalism is a big one, and I hope you can touch on that when you talk, but and also hate speech. And there are also economic factors. Arakan State, also known as Rakhine State, we say Arakan in English, and Rakhine is the Burmese name, is the site of a lot of gas and oil reserves. And if you're following the news, a lot of investment is now happening in the gas and oil sectors and in the energy sectors in Burma. So Arakan State is sort of one of these hot zones where the EU and now a bunch of US firms are going in and putting their money. So here, these are sort of some of the umbrella factors that have been the matches that have lit this on fire. But they're not the root issues. And I think the root issues here are really state policies and state discrimination that's happened not only over the past year and a half, but over the past several decades. And these are the policies that have created a context where instability and violence is seen as okay, and have allowed Buddhist nationalists and some unsavory characters to capitalize on the instability that the government has created. And again, justice, the lack of justice and the lack of accountability that Holly talked about is allowing this to continue. And we've seen, because of international pressure, the Burmese government formed several investigative commissions. Not a single one has held any murderers of Rohingya or other minority Muslims to account. So I briefly, earlier this week on Tuesday, an organization called Fortify Rights, which is on the ground in Thailand and Burma, released a report based on leaked government documents. We've heard that in the US recently. And we're able to publish these documents for the first time, taking on a lot of personal liability. So we're thankful for them going out on the wire, but these documents have showed that these policies of discrimination against Rohingya are not new, and they're quite disturbing. And the international community, while there have been zooming ins on these violent events, the international community has been pretty much laissez-faire about everything else that the government has done to create these systems of violence in Arakan State. And I just briefly want to talk about some of these restrictions and policies against Rohingya that are still in effect today and have been in effect for many, many years. One of these is a two-child policy in Western Arakan State, in these predominantly Rohingya communities, where the state has determined, officially for the past 9 years, but unofficially for the past few decades, that Rohingya women are only allowed to have 2 children because of population explosion. Do note that there is no population explosion in Arakan State. If anything, the Rohingya population is decreasing, not increasing. But the government has created a lot of propaganda that's been picked up by Buddhist nationalists and notorious and hateful monks to find a way to cut down the Rohingya population even further. Because of the two-child policy, as you can imagine, a lot of women have been forced into abortions and have been forced to leave the country because of their pregnancies. In Arakan State, there are, in these predominantly Rohingya townships, the ratio of physicians to people is 1 to 83,000. So you have 1 physician to 83,000 Rohingya Muslims. But in the Buddhist area of Arakan State, you have 1 physician to every 681 people. So as you might imagine, women who seek abortions don't have the don't get medical follow-up, don't get medical treatment, and these abortions are done in really bare bones ways. They use the stick method, and a stick is literally used to kill the infant inside the woman's body, and she has no access to medical help afterwards. This is a government policy, and soldiers are instructed by the government to go into homes and to count the number of people in the home to make sure that the family has abided by the policy, and if there's a child or an infant or somebody who they suspect is not part of the family, they will require the mother to breastfeed the infant in front of the soldiers to ascertain if that child is a blood child. Because of this, the children that are carried to term are not allowed to be registered. They're not given birth certificates by the local government. The government doesn't consider them to be citizens or even non-citizens. They're not even considered really to be persons. And this creates numerous problems, as you can probably imagine. Access to education, access to, in the future, marriage and employment is not an option for them. The government very conservatively estimates that 60,000 Rohingya children in Arakan State are unregistered. My guess is that it's probably far, far more. So this is one of the examples of these policies that the government has imposed on these minority Muslim communities. Another one is a marriage restriction in which women and men who propose to be married have to go stand before various officials at various different township, village levels and prove that they are related to their parents. They have to bring in their parents, they have to bring in other witnesses, they have to take a photograph for the authorities in which they cannot, if they are men, they have to shave their beards, which is a violation of their religious tradition as Muslims, and if they're women, they're not allowed to wear their hijab or their headscarf, which is demoralizing. The widows and divorcees who try to become remarried must wait 3 years, and they have to make incredibly large payments to authorities and able to be registered. Quintana, who's our UN envoy in Burma, he is what we call the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Burma, and he is an independent voice of what's going on in Burma. He does numerous trips on the ground. He's been in Buthodong prison, which is this prison in Western Arakan State where most Rohingya are held, where a lot of Rohingya are held, and in his visits during the prison, he found out that most of the men in the prison are being held on bogus marriage and immigration charges. So actually in 2012 alone, between 2,000 and 2,500 Rohingya men were imprisoned in these areas simply for offenses like marriage, marrying a woman, repairing their homes without government permission, traveling to another village. This is the government. These aren't the Buddhist nationalists, these aren't Buddhist mobs, this is the government imposing these policies. So what we at U.S. Campaign for Burma do is advocate for justice and accountability for the victims of these massacres and for the victims of just these daily government restrictions on people. And these aren't restrictions even on the refugees. There are 140,000 internally displaced people in refugee camps. These are just restrictions on everyday people in their villages and in their homes. And there are numerous other restrictions that were laid out in this report. I highly recommend it to you. The organization is called Fortify Rights. But I think it's worth mentioning and worth realizing that these persecutory policies have laid the foundation for an environment where violence is considered okay. If the government's doing it, and the government's not going to provide any legal redress, then it's everyday civilians are further enabled to commit violence themselves. And we haven't seen the government step up to condemn any of these policies. In fact, we've seen government leaders over the past year and a half come out and recommend and defend these policies to the international community. And we've not seen a single official express any concern or awareness that these policies and that state discrimination might be a factor, perhaps, in these massacres and bouts of violence that we've seen. So I just want to stress that these massacres don't come out of nowhere. They come out of decades of very intense, targeted persecution of these people. And justice and accountability is so necessary to put any sort of stop in the cycle of violence.
I just wanted to know ethnically what government is.
Yeah, the government is Burman. They're doing a census right now, actually, and Rohingya aren't going to be counted as Rohingya on the census, so we can get back to that. But there are what is commonly understood that 60% of the population is Burman. Burmans control the government, and 40% of the population is ethnic. Local and state governments tend to have ethnic actors on them, but they're appointed by the Burman central government.
And I think Rohingya are 5%, and other Christian groups are
Well,
5%.
Muslim.
Yeah, Muslims are about 4 or 5% of the population.
Estimated to be 4%, but we can come back to this because
the census, yeah.
I had asked Adama Deng to speak, and I really wish he had been here. He is the United Nations, he's the Secretary General's Special Advisor on Genocide, and he and I have sort of become friends and have conversations from time to time, and he has spontaneously brought this up as an area of great concern for him and his office. So the UN definitely sees this as genocide, or at least going in that direction. Genocide is a very powerful word at the United Nations because it has legal implications, and it really obligates the international community to do something about it. And from my own estimation of what's going on, it certainly seems genocidal to me. But I haven't heard the UN actually say this officially. It probably should, from what I'm hearing. I want to make some remarks just kind of personally in my own right. I tell many people, and usually people get pretty shocked. I actually was a practicing Muslim for 7 years. I converted when I was posted to Sudan, and I was very attracted particularly by the mystical Sufi side of Islam, and was very happy as a practicing Muslim until I came to this country. And when I came to America, I found many Muslims in this country to be quite homophobic, and as a gay man, I felt like I didn't fit in the way that I did feel like I belonged when I was in Africa. And so growing up as a Christian American and then spending 7 years as a Muslim, I've been able to sort of absorb attitudes and belief systems from both sides, as an American and as a Muslim. And as Americans, we tend to, I think many people are shocked to find that Buddhists are doing such horrible things. It's counterintuitive for most of us. And we think that, Buddhists are nice people and they sit in the lotus position and they're for peace and very passive. Forgetting, of course, entirely the killing fields of Cambodia, and that was all Buddhist as well. So there certainly have been times in Buddhist history when they've been very violent, as have Christians, as have Muslims and Jews and everybody else. Certainly violence is not restricted to one religion or another. But our thinking, we tend to put things in boxes, and we tend to think, okay, Buddhists are nice and peaceful, and Muslims are a bunch of terrorists, and they're out to get us. I was actually in Florida. I was at the very large UU congregation in Vero Beach, Florida. It was sort of announced that I had spent 7 years as a practicing Muslim, and I had a Unitarian Universalist come up to me and he said, there are statistics that show that if as much as 2% of the population are Muslim, that everything starts to change, and we'll all have to start eating kosher. And he did say kosher and not halal, which I found a little amusing. So watch out for those Muslims, because you might have to start eating kosher food. But there's this great fear of Muslims, and we have this fear in America because we see Muslims as perpetrators and we don't see them as victims. As a Muslim, my 7 years as a Muslim, most Muslims see themselves as victims. And they talk about the Crusades, and they talk about so many times when the West and other people have come into their land. The Mongols came in and destroyed Damascus and destroyed Islamic civilization. They've been invaded and conquered. They used to have this wonderful civilization in Spain and were pushed out of that. So there's a whole history of Islamic history where Muslims are not perpetrators, they're the victims. And certainly this was the case in Sarajevo and in Yugoslavia. And most Muslims felt that the Western response to the ethnic cleansing of Muslims in the former Yugoslavia was slow. That we were slow off the mark. But we do get credit for doing something eventually. This is yet another example where there's egregious human rights violations. You can't listen to these statistics, and you can't watch these videos, and you can't understand what's going on in Burma, and then how, you've got a small minority of the population that is being so ill-treated and is being massacred and is being butchered in so many ways, and the international community is essentially doing nothing. And this reinforces the idea within Muslims that Christians, Unitarians, Jews, and everybody really don't care. When Muslims get killed, the international community really doesn't care. And I think it's incumbent on us, particularly as liberal progressives and people that, try not to take sides in these kinds of religious questions, to care, to look at the facts, to look at what's going on, and to say, okay, this is genocide. This is something really awful. It's repugnant. It's disgusting, and there ought to be some moral outrage that comes from us. And the fact that most of us don't even know about it, don't learn about it, and are not, really sort of organizing around this, is telling. And again, second largest religion in the world, which is Islam, they look at this indifference on our part and they say, well, what do you expect? That's them all over again. So I'm hoping that we can manage some moral outrage over this, because it really is worth that. Certainly diplomats, particularly Muslim diplomats at the United Nations, are expressing their concern, and they are outraged, and I think they're outraged that we're not outraged. So I think we need to build some solidarity with the people in Burma and do whatever we can to stop it. And there is sort of this momentum building. I mean, we've got this narrative that we're going around that Burma is democratizing. Things are getting better in Burma. It's time to send in investment and start doing all these wonderful things in Burma. And that should be definitely conditional on this kind of stuff stopping. and stopping now. And it shouldn't be gradual. It should either you stop this genocide, and I'm going to call it genocide in Burma, or you don't get the investment and you don't get the aid and you don't get any of this. And U.S. government, I was in the State Department, they don't like that kind of language, but that's what I think is necessary. So that's my personal opinion.
Hi, my name is Nee, and my full name is Nisam. I'm a Rohingya from Burma, and I grew up in Burma, and I came to United States on 2005. Also, my parents, basically we all Muslims, so you all know it. So basically my parents, both of my parents are government service. My mom was a school teacher. My dad used to work in a government department. It's a cooperative department. Both of my parents, they have to resign forcefully due to my religious and my ethnicity. And when I born in Burma, I was in Arkan until 6 years old, and later on my dad he's promoted, and he went to a different township, so we have to migrate to Yangon, which is the former capital city of Burma. And later on, 1982, when the citizenship law they established, and they forcefully, they don't want my dad to be working in the government department. So since then, we were out of states, and then later on we have to move from the country. Let me share a little bit about the conflict between Buddhist and Muslim populations. Overwhelmingly is one-sided attack on the small Muslim minority by the Buddhist majority is backed by the Burmese government. The root of problems of the Rohingya is a systematically ethnic cleansing. It has been nearly 36 years of genocide. Because I would say genocide because since 1982, when the citizenship new law applies, Rohingya was not able to move one town to another. They cannot get education. They cannot get proper medical treatments. So we were suffering decade by decade. So it's a long suffering. So actually, this law is implemented by the General Nguyen. He's one of the Revolution Council military leaders. Since then, he established the law that it is systematically ethnic cleansing to the Rohingyas. Later on, starting from 2012, they spread to all over the country, led by the Burmese extremist group is called Mount Wayatu. This is the guy. Because of him, a lot of Rohingyas dies, a lot of Burmese Muslims dies across the country. So I would say that all the riot and violence is backed by the government of Burma, because when a Shui gas pipeline in Rakhine townships, they want to devise the attention that Chinese influence in Burma, so they create the conflict between Rakhine and Rohingyas. So since from them Rohingya are systematically ethnic cleansings, the violence is increasing day by day. Recently, and I think today, you might know about the MSF. They were expelled from the country today, just today, because it is directly order from President's office saying that MSF is involved in 1 month ago there was a massacre. It's a town in what do you call it? Dushiradans. It's one of the township in Arakan. They killed more than 200 people. They burned down a lot of houses. So apparently, Burmese government is accusing that MSF is reporting all the casualty and a report to the international community. Due to that, MSF is no longer giving them any extension of the humanitarian work in Burma. So, top of that, they have a very big agenda just to wipe out this Rohingya from the land, simply being a Muslim. They don't want to see any Muslim in the land. This is the first thing I want to say. And it's not only government is backing up, also the security force inside the land itself is involved in all kind of activity in the violence. So if you look at the report, if you just Google it like Rohingya, you will see all kind of news. But what we are doing right now is I'm working for the RohingyaBlogger.com. Probably you might know if you Google it. So we have a group of people inside the Arakan state. They are sending out daily all the news. So if you compare to just now the Madam show, the slideshow in the Meitila, if you compare to the Meitila violence, in Arakan violence is completely different. Meitila is a kind of open space. Everybody, at least all the journalists, international journalists and international foreigner can go inside. But Arakan is different because government purposely block all the international medias and international organizations just to cover up their violence. So it is very hard to get the image. But what we're doing is we're trying to get the image from inside from Burma, inside from Arakan, to show the world that how they are treating us, how they are killing us, how they are destroying the entire community. I don't know whether you know or not. Every day, 100,000 of people are fleeing from the land. 100,000. Can you imagine? They have a little boat that carry more than 1,000 people. Maybe more than that. I don't know. Some of the people they die on the roads. Some of the people they caught by the human trafficker. It is all over the country, all over the country in Southeast Asia. You can Google it and you will find a lot of news. And if I tell you all kind of stories, it's going to be very long, so I want to cut it short. But I really appreciate to all the international community that they keep releasing the statement and reports. But as a Rohingya, I don't think it's going to help us. But report usually say that we are deeply concerned, we are deeply worrying. It's deeply worrying and concerned. It doesn't really affect us. Look at this. Burmese government is just covering their mess. So what they are doing was every single violence, they create a commission for inquiry, investigation team. The investigation team, can you believe it? The people who lead the violence, they put in the member on the commission. So do you really think that is going to come from the positive report? No. So we need international independent investigation team from U.S., UN, whatever. I mean, just to get into the land and try to control the situation. But right now, I don't see any improvement. The situation is getting worse day by day. So also, I want also the UN to be intervened in the land so that, they can save a lot of innocent life. Women are getting raped day by day. Security forces is harassing and torturing and taking away all the property from the Rohingyas. This is worse day by day. We need to stop it. If you, it's not about the religious. It's about the humanity. We have to save this humanity. Thank you.
My name is Alex. I'm an editor at Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. Thank you for having me, and it's been great. I should start with a disclaimer that I'm surrounded by experts, but I'm definitely not an expert on this topic. But I've studied. It's been of interest to us, and there's been a need in the Buddhist community in the U.S. and in Burma and the U.S. and abroad to respond to this. I can start out. Bruce was speaking a bit about common. What's the Buddhist and what's the Muslim in the mainstream imagination? And I think this is very important because it plays into both the misconceptions that are fanning the fire here, as well as it accounts in part for a stunted response here in the U.S. and among the Buddhist community and among Buddhist activist groups. I think we have to disabuse ourselves of simplistic notions of both Buddhism and Islam that strain the complex realities of both traditions. And we dumb them down. One scholar has actually said that to look at the kind of overwhelmingly positive view of Buddhists in America, the only appropriate frame to view that is to look at the negative one for Muslims. So we really have to interrogate both of these misconceptions. I should say that the current strife in Burma is in no way caused by religion. As we've been talking about, state forces are at work. It's an extremely complex issue. But we're seeing misconceptions and preconceptions about religion being preyed upon and harnessed by pernicious forces among the general populace of Burma. The Buddha postulated that all human suffering is rooted in ignorance and delusion, and in Burma we're seeing the most tragic manifestations of delusions. A simple misconception seems very innocent until you see its murderous expression or genocidal expression. And I want to be clear that while preconceptions about both Buddhist and Muslim faiths play a role in the tragedy, it would be a terrible mistake, a grave mistake, to misconstrue this as a religious phenomenon, especially when the stakes are so high. I'd go so far as to say that dismissing this as a religious phenomenon would be to do a violence to this tragedy. When we at Tricycle first heard about the violence against the Rohingya in Rakhine State, we were all a bit shocked, and part of that is because it goes so strongly against common conceptions of both, specifically of Buddhism as a kind of pacifist, meditator, sitting in lotus position, blissing out. This is actually a very modern conception of Buddhism that originated in Burma. And that was a product of Buddhist nationalism, which was an instrumental force in the independence of Burma from the British Empire. But it's, to use a terrible cliche, it's a double-edged sword, Buddhist nationalism. When the king was deposed in Burma, it became the duty of the individual citizen to preserve the Dharma. So there's a real history in Burma of each citizen's responsibility to defend Buddhism. And the violence carried out against Muslims has employed this rhetoric of defending the Dharma, of defending Buddhism. And you see the 969 movement, we're out to... Yeah, we're... and you see this state and Sangha, the Buddhist community, ally here under Buddhist nationalism, which is a double-edged sword. Even a single-edged sword is a double-edged sword, someone said to me recently. Now, this was especially shocking because the images of brave monks marching the streets for and with their compatriots in the so-called Saffron Revolution in 2007 were still fresh in the minds and in the media. But it quickly became clear that many of those monks were now engaging in hate speech and inciting violence. In 2007, the Burmese Sangha, which is the clergy and the community of monks, proved themselves an extremely potent social and political force. And they were on the side of the people. The government had good reason to fear them and even better reason to befriend them. The Sangha of Burma, even in colonial times, has struggled to stay relevant, and now the military state, after 2007, struggles to stay relevant as well. So there's a reason for at least factions of each group to ally, and both of these groups actually pull from the same recruitment pool. Young men, usually young men who aren't from wealthy families. I'm not talking about the military leaders, I'm talking about soldiers and monks. They can choose to be fed by the military or the Buddhist community or the monk, the Sangha. So they're connected. The monks are trying to represent, or the monks, they represent the same interests. They're neighbors, they're brothers, these soldiers and these monks. So part of this, following 2007, the Saffron Revolution, because we didn't have people were confused, people didn't have the knowledge of history and the intellectual tools to understand it, there was a silence, and especially in the American Buddhist community. There was an undeniably stunted response from Buddhist activist groups, which are few and far between to begin with. But it wasn't something that we could gloss over. Seeing Buddhism used to justify violence and terror, and it should go without saying that there's nothing that would validate that in the Buddhist tradition, and it's been used for nation building and empire building throughout history, in spite of the overwhelmingly positive picture that Buddhism enjoys in the West. But it became clear that Buddhists have to stand up and speak out against this violence. I guess maybe that's enough for now, but I'd just like to raise the question in closing that there's reason to listen to the concerns and fears of the Burmese people, Burmese Buddhists included, and until their concerns and fears are addressed in some way, not to say that the government does whatever these people want them to, but unless their concerns are addressed, there's no reason to think that the violence will stop.
Could you articulate what you think those fears are?
Yeah, a lot of Southeast Asia, and Asia in general, used to be predominantly Buddhist. And we've seen other religions take down, especially in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, Malay used to be predominantly Buddhist and Hindu nation, and now it's the biggest Islamic nation in the world. So there's this fear that Burma will become Islamicized, that they'll lose part of Burmese identity is Buddhism, and Aung San Suu Kyi will say that. She'll say, we're a Buddhist nation and this is a nation of Buddhist values. So there's that fear. There's also fear of it seems like especially fears of the marriage customs of Muslims, particularly Orthodox Muslims, cause a lot of fear. It's viewed as a way to convert Buddhists. So people are afraid that the identity of Burma will be lost and it will become an Islamic country and it will go the way of Indonesia. And we see the same things happening in South Thailand. So these are real concerns that we have to address in some way, and it's extremely difficult. I just want to raise the question at this point. There are some lines that we could take from there.
Before we do one more round, just watching the clock, I think the next round should be a little faster so that then we can include some exchange with everyone here. And I'm wondering if the next comments that people make kind of look forward 2014, 2015. There's an election coming, there's a census that was referred to, there's legislation on the Hill. You know, what can be done is where I'm hoping we can head, at least somewhat. This morning I was at a dialogue of Muslims and Buddhists at the Turkish Center in Manhattan and with the head of the Buddhist Council of New York. They're aware of this issue. They couldn't come, but they're aware. There are a lot of conversations happening, which is great. The head of the ambassador for the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Mr. Gökçen, he's aware of this event, couldn't make it. But there, you know, so this may seem small, but these conversations branch out and connect to other conversations. So in terms of on the ground, or in the UN, or on the Hill, or interfaith, you know, what is possible? What do you think should be done in the coming year? And whoever wants to start with that, we don't have to go in any particular order. Why don't I start with the Capitol Hill, because that's sort of a concrete thing.
Hey, thanks. Just a couple things. MSF, if you're unaware, MSF is Doctors Without Borders. So the Buddhist population in Arakan State has been, over the past couple of weeks, launching these huge protests against Doctors Without Borders, because Doctors Without Borders have been treating Rohingya casualties from the massacres. Really big deal. And you also have the Burmese government calling the UN basically a crackpot for issuing this statement, calling for an investigation of this massacre of 48 people that happened last month. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case you were confused about the MSF connection. Also, in terms of the UN, we're seeing some countries in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia and Indonesia, that are Muslim countries, actually back up the Burmese government for financial reasons, because they're part of the ASEAN community, and ASEAN, membership in ASEAN trumps religious identity in Southeast Asia, and we're actually seeing ambassadors from Malaysia and Indonesia sort of step out, take themselves out, wash their hands of it. They don't want to get involved because of competing interests. So in terms of where we go from here, as you brought up, there's a big census coming up. It's actually already, data's just started being collected this week, and there's been a huge amount of controversy over the ethnic and religious questions on the census. The Rohingya are not being recognized on the census in its current form, so Rohingya people who fill out the census have to mark other, and possibly write in their own identity. And that's, I mean, there are 140 something ethnic groups that are on the census, and they won't put the Rohingya on there. So that's pretty big. The census is being funded by the UN Population Fund. So it's UN money, and we'd love to see, and we're pushing for the UN to push the brakes until we see the census being implemented in a non-discriminatory way. Because if we get data back from the census that shows that there are no Rohingya in Burma, the government will use this for its own propaganda. It's a mess. So that's one of the big things that's coming up just around the corner. And then another thing that PHR has really led the way on is a resolution in Congress, resolution HR 418, I believe, which basically condemns the ethnic religious violence happening right now. It's not legally binding. It's a sense of the Congress type of, that's what a resolution is. It's passed the subcommittee, and it's just this week, and it's about to pass committee, and it will pass committee because the chairman of that committee is a co-sponsor of the bill, of the resolution. So that's exciting. But again, like Free Rohingya Campaign has articulated, a resolution doesn't do anything toward real resolution. So what we're doing at U.S. Campaign for Burma is trying to make, we're doing a couple things. One, trying to make a legal case for how the persecution in Burma amounts to crimes against humanity. So we're working with the Harvard Law Clinic, the Harvard Human Rights Clinic, and some other folks down in D.C. on the legal end to make an argument through the Rome Statute that what's going on in Burma does amount to ethnic cleansing, does amount to crimes against humanity, and ideally does amount to genocide. That's really political. So we're trying to do what works pragmatically, though I think it is a genocide. And once we have that, looking at a way to bring it to the UN Security Council and to get the UN Security Council to implement an international investigation would be the ideal. Unfortunately, due to the political narrative here in the US as well with the Obama administration, we want to see Burma as a foreign policy success story. And the Obama administration hasn't had that many foreign policy success stories. And so they're really using this as a wedge issue. And even as you saw in the State of the Union, Obama said, Burma, sort of waved the Burma flag. So we're really coming up against a lot of friction there, and so it would be great for the liberal community to really petition Obama in a real way to say, hey, we'd like to see you put the money, put the U.S.'s money where its mouth is. And if you want to say, oh, reform is going on in Burma, well, I think we would like to see everyone be a beneficiary of reform and not victims of preventable human rights abuses. So that's one thing, making the legal case to try to get a momentum for an international investigation. Obviously, doing this outside of the UN hasn't worked. The U.S., in an unprecedented move, we're really happy. The Obama administration actually called on the government of Burma to put international officials on its investigation that's going on now into the January events. And obviously the Burmese government said no, and basically lambasted the U.S. Embassy. But we're excited that happened, and we're excited they took sort of a move outside the box to issue that call. And so we're hopeful that Samantha Powers and others will make more of this. So that's a couple things. Also, we have a military bill in Congress right now. It's called the Burmese Freedom and Democracy Act, I think, and it's been introduced both in the House and in the Senate. And we would so love you guys to go on our website, uscampaignforburma.org, and to email your congressman. This would place conditions on the U.S. military. Right now, the administration is trying to do military engagement with the Burmese regime. And this is just way too soon. Currently in Arakan State, we have Rohingya being held as sex slaves on military bases. We have a full-out large-scale war in northern Burma against Kachin Christians. Obviously, the army is committing human rights abuses against Muslims. So our military bill would put restrictions on the U.S.'s funding toward the Burmese military. On preconditions that the government should meet, for example, removing troops from these areas, supporting constitutional reform, etc. So these are just some things going on now. You can go on actually PHR's website and sign a petition for the Rohingya resolution. And it is a consequential political statement, so we are excited about it. We just think it has to come in tandem with real investigative measures as well.
From the task force. And so I just wanted to give you a chance, because I know that you spoke You organized a petition drive that was very effective a few weeks ago, and you've done a lot on this issue. I wondered if we have the mic for the audience member. If people might want to reflect, but I wanted to give you a chance to speak first. By the way, Burma Task Force USA does have these action alerts that we send out to tens of thousands of people, and it's our stuff is geared to the Muslim community, which, by the way, is either 2 million or 8 million in this country. Speaking of census and politicized numbers, we're trying to mobilize folks to be part of the solution here. Habib Ahmed is definitely part of that, and a leader at his mosque, which is mostly doctors. So here you go.
Thank you, Adam. Good evening. We are the largest mosque in Nassau County, which is the county next to Queens County, and we do petitions every Friday. After the prayer, we have about 500 to 600 people, and we sent a petition asking for the House resolution you just mentioned for other the congressional delegation from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, about 85 members of Congress, something like that. We sent individual letters to all of them, signed by about almost 350 to 400 people, requesting them to become a co-sponsor of that resolution. And we have done similar things, and we distribute that thing which is hanging 10 minutes. You can donate your 10 minutes and make 2 phone calls or 3 phone calls to your congressman or senator, and things like that. But definitely more needs to be done, and that was the reason I just came from him all the way from Long Island to see what is happening here, and I was really very happy to listen to many of you as what you're doing right now. Thank you very much. If I may ask a question of that young man over there, the first young man here. Buddhism started from India, if I'm not mistaken, where I come from. I was born and brought up in India. If the Burmese are so concerned about Buddhism will be eliminated from Burma, or Buddhism will be destroyed in Burma, my thing will be, why don't they go back to where it started from and make sure that India becomes Burmese first, 1 billion plus 1 billion plus individuals, and then go from there and worry about Burma later on.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the history, or the mainstream history of Buddhism and Islam is, for lack of a better phrase, totally fucked. It's mainly wrong. Scholars now are realizing that most of the history, if you look at a popular history of Islam and Buddhism, it's Muslim conquerors coming and destroying the Dharma. This history, it has to do with, part of it is problems in scholarship, that these scholars have been reading Muslim histories where the Muslim conquerors are have been found to exaggerate their exploits. It's the most popular story is the destruction of Nalanda in India, which is the shining example of the perfect Buddhist academic institution where people from all over Asia came to study. The popular story is that it was ransacked, there was slaughter, everyone was murdered. What really happened was Buddhists, the elite made deals with their Muslim overlords to maintain power. And the institution wasn't destroyed, but actually continued to exist. I think the invasion was in 1202. It continued to exist for another century, maybe a little bit over another century. And Buddhism died out in India for very different reasons. This history encapsulates the popular history, mainstream history of Buddhism and Islam, and it's not correct. It's we need to disabuse ourselves of these histories and our common misconceptions about both religions that dumb them down. As for In Burma, I just want to quickly invoke the anti-imperialist revolutionary Aung San. He is recognized as the architect of Burmese independence from British colonialism. And he set out to forge a multiculturalist, secular, and civic nationalism in Burma. That if he succeeded, it would have moved Burma away from the provincialist, blood and faith-based view of national identity, which doesn't really work in the modern world. But Aung San was gunned down along with his entire cabinet in a government building in 1947. His cabinet included a Shan, a Karen, and a Muslim by the name of Urazak, who was the Minister of Education and Planning and was also a prominent socialist in Burma. The policy of this cabinet rejected the partitioning of the nation along community or religious lines. So Aung San and his principles still remain incredibly relevant to Burma today. And I think we have to go back to Aung San and continue to invoke his name because he's already he's a hero in Burma. He's celebrated every year on what's called Martyrs' Day. I think we have to return to his ideals of a secular kind of nationalism because the Buddhist nationalism is not working out. Of course, after he was killed, it pretty much set off what the president of Burma called at some point the longest running set of armed conflicts anywhere in the world. All right, that's it.
I don't think we should trivialize the fear of a national people, the Burmese, who may feel that their culture and religion and way of life may be disappearing. I think we have some of that going on in this country. This country, of course, has a long history of being ruled by straight white men, and that's a changing now. And there's a lot of fear around that change. And we're seeing that play out in our politics in fairly dramatic ways. And what we're struggling to do in this country is find a way to accommodate everybody of whatever race or color or sexual orientation or gender, and that we all can live together and work cooperatively together. And that's obviously, I think that's the vision that's just been articulated for Burma. That needs to be, that needs to be the vision, not for one religion to be ascendant over another religion, but that all religions and all groups and all ethnicities can live together. And it's wonderful. There's that example already in Burmese history. Okay. So that's what we ought to be working for. And it's hard when so much violence has already taken place. It's the same situation you have with the Israelis and Palestinians. When you have that much blood that's been shed, it's awful hard to forgive each other and to decide, okay, we're going to live in this land together and work together, which to me ultimately is what I think the Israelis and Palestinians need to do at some point. But this is not easy work, but it's the only way that the violence is really going to stop, is if people can work together and alleviate the fears, because the fears are going to be there, and sometimes the fears are actually legitimate fears, but they have to be overcome.
I may be naive, but I cannot imagine Burma becoming a dominant Muslim country. Buddhism permeates Burmese culture so extensively, so deeply, so widely. I cannot imagine it yielding to Islam. I've read that food aid has come in for the Rohingya from Muslim sources, and I'm wondering if any military aid has come in to the Rohingya from outside Muslim groups.
If military aid has come in?
Yeah, I'm wondering.
No. What we've seen is in our state, the government block any humanitarian aid, a lot of humanitarian aid from coming in whatsoever at all. And there have been, the UN is there in some capacity, and some groups like Doctors Without Borders are there. But there's no military aid coming in. In fact, now the EU and the UK and Australia and the US are trying to give military aid to the Burmese military to train them in better practices. So the money is messed up, and the money is going to the wrong places. And in fact, USAID, the US's development agency, has pulled funding, or has chosen not to fund some of these displaced communities, particularly the Kachin Christians in the north, for political reasons. So, yeah, the aid.
More Al-Qaeda or something, someone like that.
No.
No, I think in the 1980s there may have been some militias, had nothing to do with extremism, it just had to do with self-defense. There have been many waves of displacement, and some people have estimated up to 1 million Rohingya have been displaced over the decades. So, I mean, there's 140 that we're counting now, 140,000 that we're counting now, but there are other waves. And so in the past there were some people who were fighting back, I believe, but that's not even possible.
The Burmese government is very clever. Speaking about terrorists, Rohingya has never involved in any terrorism inside the country, because Rohingya is simply, they are defenseless. They have no arm, nothing. Just only, they express it to the world only by, showing their concern, their voice. That is the only thing. Another one thing is, you say the Buddhists are fearing that Muslims are going to be dominated in Burma. That's not true, because Muslims inside Burma only have 4%. Those 4% is living all over is all over the country. It's not only in particular in one place. Speaking about the living, they're living in the Kachin state, Meitila, Mandalay, Yangon, so it's spread all over the place. But the government is, what they are doing is they're very cleverly saying that, oh, these people, they're coming from India, they're coming from Bangladesh. They're calling them as a Kala. You know what is the meaning of Kala? Kala is just like a nigger, I'm sorry to say, in United States. It's a discriminatory word. They call us a Kala, but we don't like it. We are not Kala. We are not a migrant from the Bangladesh. We have been living in that land for the centuries. We are native of that land, but they are cleverly trying to twist to the Burmese community that we are the migrant, we are Kala. Because Kala is also called to the different skin. If you're light skin, if you're dark skin, they call Kala. It is the Buddhist. It isn't the way the Buddhism teach to the people. It's not true. It is all about the government policy, because they have elections in 2015, and also they have the opposition leader, the Aung San Suu Kyi party. So they just want to create all kind of conflict between Buddhists and Muslim. So we are the victim, actually. They use us to brainwash the people. Thank you.
Thank you. I came up here directly from the event at the United Nations for the 20th anniversary of the Rwanda genocide. And there was an eminent panel there. And Gregory Stanton, who's the author of the 8 Steps of Genocide, was cited from the panel as having done pioneering, seminal, groundbreaking work that we can all use to decide when there is a genocide. So there's well worked out methodology for defining whether there's a genocide or not. That shouldn't be an issue at all. But I can tell you that there was much concern, there was much discussion of the perennial phrase, never again, and there was much citation of other genocides that have followed, and the ones that were cited particularly that are going on now are places like Central African Republic, and it was all, I think, really about Africa, but nobody mentioned, Burma. Really? So I thought, isn't this interesting? Now, it might have been a question of exactly who was on the panel, but there was one speaker in particular who was quite virulent about the failures of every actor, from the Catholic Church to the State Department and the U.S. government to the United Nations, and each of the presentations were rather long. And it gave multiple citations that were just irrefutable, and the whole thing's on video on the UN website if anybody wants to see it. So that's just the framing thing about the UN. The other aspect is that I think Holly's phrase "gold rush" describes what I'm seeing as a fundamental factor in Burma's current period, which is that it's not a rush for markets like the rush into China. It's a rush for resources and also supply lines. And the rush for resources, I understand the strategic value of those things and so forth, but really the failure to put conditionality of human rights on there is inexcusable, unforgivable, to use Ed Koch's immortal words. And the question I would have about investment is, for any U.S. Firms, or firms that are subject to U.S. regulation, perhaps through the use of the capital markets, which includes a lot of world corporations, the question I would have would be, are they using any kind of government guarantees for cross-border risk, political risk, currency risk, or anything like that? For example, Exim Bank in the United States would be an obvious question. There may be others as well. If they're using those, that's the lever with which to go after the money side of it. So I don't know. I'm concerned about about what we can do about the enablers, about the funders, and you use that expression also. So if we can do that, maybe that's a way we can get leverage. We should obviously help all these individual campaigns, but things like sanctions, my first thought about sanctions in any country is, well, who do they really affect? Are we doing more damage to the people we're trying to protect than we are to the government? I don't know. Somebody have to enlighten us about that. Thank you.
I'm less informed about this than most people in this room, but I would love to know, I guess my vision of Burma is of the time that Aung San Suu Kyi was imprisoned in her home, and it was the focus of world attention, and everyone was so relieved when she left. And I guess that's where I kind of lost touch. And I'd like to know where she is in all this today. I'm just really curious to know how that's played out.
Good evening. Thank you guys for coming and sharing with us. My question, I guess, is mostly directed at Rachel. I'm curious, given the tools we have, social media and the internet and distribution channels and platforms, what kind of resources you guys are putting toward storytelling and creating content to get the message out. It seems unfortunate that so many people have no idea about these conflicts. And I'm wondering, obviously politically there's levers to pull, but how much of that couldn't be pushed forward and accelerated with some storytelling? So I'm wondering where you guys are with that.
As far as the UN genocide thing goes, so I wrote a law journal article that's coming out in the Emory International Law Review making the case for ethnic cleansing. And while there are indicators that because of all this never again stuff, they're so political. The atmosphere around getting these things through the process is so political. The U.S. won't put itself on the line. The State Department's not calling it ethnic cleansing. We have too many interests in Burma. So as far as the investment goes, I've been on the phone with Mitsubishi all week because they're launching this big displacement project out of Rangoon. And these big actors, now that they've been given the go-ahead by their governments, are going ahead. And some risk assessments have held people back. And some companies that are too small to do big due diligence have actually been weeded out because the State Department requires companies to report on their investments of over $500,000 because of a big campaign that we were part of. to get at least some accountability on top of these companies who are going in. But we have companies, Crowley Marine Services, based down in Texas. Really? Yeah, Hercules. These big companies have gone into the oil and gas sector. Coca-Cola is now going in. Their land acquiring process has been pretty sketchy. I'll talk to you if you want to know, but yeah, huge problems there. Some companies are doing it well and doing their due diligence, but you can't do it well even if you're doing it well, because everybody there who has money is affiliated or was affiliated with the regime. So it's impossible to invest. So even a big company like Coke, who prides itself on its corporate accountability, is going in there with some risk. And so especially these small companies that aren't doing their due diligence and that aren't reporting well to the State Department, they're going to run into some trouble. So we're actually doing a big report card on companies who are beginning to invest, and that's going to come out next month. So I can keep tabs on that. As far as the internet and storytelling goes, who are you, and do you want to be our consultant? Talk to me afterward, because we need you. Yeah, we have our Twitter, we have our Facebook, and we have our blog, but so there's so much going on, and there's only 4 of us. So we need people to step up, and so I like to contract people to come on and just think through this stuff with us. Talk to me on the phone. I'd love to talk.
We definitely have to make better stories to understand this, or else what do? We just have these atrocities and we don't know what to, we have Schindler's List, which is a movie I'm not fond of. I think what partly got me into this is that I'm Jewish before a Buddhist, and it's made me very sensitive to any kind of genocide happening anywhere. But also to look at the reasons. If we just have the atrocities, then there's nowhere to go from there. There's no line of flight. About the storytelling, we need better stories to make sense of this. It's very difficult though, because we don't want to violate human dignity by explaining. Only the kind of analysis that can be emancipatory is useful. And also, I'd say writing, not content. Just writing and not content. Content is something you funnel in, but writing is the story. Yeah. And also, thank you for mentioning the gold rush. There are plenty of parties that will benefit from continued unrest, and in Burma and Rakhine State in particular, which is a particularly impoverished region. And the Rakhine Buddhists are actually kind of marginalized Buddhists. They're different. In Mektila, you have Burmese Buddhists. And the Rakhine Buddhists are kind of a marginalized Buddhist group that was historically persecuted by the Burmese Buddhists. So we don't have a monolithic kind of Buddhism here, but you could see how Buddhist nationalism might function and how a scapegoat might be used to bring Buddhists together in the interest of nationalism.
I think Madam asking about the Aung San Suu Kyi, right? Where is Aung San Suu Kyi? Aung San Suu Kyi is having fun right now.
We don't know.
You know why I'm saying? Because when Aung San Suu Kyi was in the jails, we went to the street to fight for her. We went in front of the bullet. Now, when she free from the house arrest, she went to all over the world. She received the Nobel Prize. She received all kind of gold medals, but she never speak about the Rohingyas. Why? She not even dare to use the name of Rohingya. Can you believe it? She is a human rights defender. She is a Nobel Prize winner.
You know, people kind of taking sides. I think it's human nature to take sides for the people that we like. And we give a pass to people we like, and we really come down hard on people we don't like. There's a Facebook video that I thought was pretty cool. There's a white guy and a black guy. And the white guy starts to try to steal this car here in Manhattan. And he spent something like 20 minutes trying to steal this car. And the police went by and people went by and nobody said anything to him. And there he is trying to, steal the car. Then the black guy is there for like a minute or two, and he immediately is put up against the wall. They call the police are there, he's getting arrested. And that's how we are. And as we look at this, we cannot say, oh, well, we like the Buddhists, but we don't like the Muslims, so it's okay. It's not okay. We've got to look at what's being done and not say, okay, we like this group and we don't like that group. That's not, we ought to be bigger than that. We have to be bigger than that. And what's being done is really, really bad. I don't know whether it ticks off all 8 counts of genocide, but I think we've got quite a few on the way to it. I did want to make a mention about the Rome Statute and the ICC. That's a long process. I actually chair the Faith and Ethics Network for the International Criminal Court, and we work on ICC issues. You would have to bring a case against an individual, so you're probably the president of the country, and charge him. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the Security Council. It could be the chief prosecutor. Okay, I'm talking about the ICC, which is the Rome Statute, which you said. Okay. ICJ perhaps could be another vehicle. But these legal means are long and tedious and probably are not going to bring the kind of relief that we want. I am not a big favor, I don't like sanctions. And of course, Burma has been under sanctions for decades, and now sanctions are being removed. And when it was under sanctions, what did the sanctions do? Well, maybe they did something, I don't know, it's hard to say. I'm very big on conditionality. You get the goodies if you do good, and you dangle a carrot in front of them and say, this is what you get, but this is what you have to do in order to get the investment. And as I said earlier, it can't be gradual. It's, in the next 10 years you're going to stop killing people. No, you have to stop killing people now. And every government has a responsibility to protect its citizens. And any government that's not protecting its citizens and not providing equal opportunities, equal rights, equal things to everybody in that country is violating international law and is not doing its job and is culpable. Well, yeah. And no, it's not. The problem isn't solved.
I think that's all the time we have. We have to be horrified, and yet, rather than go home depressed, might be more appropriate to go home angry. Channel some of that anger into action, and if possible, sign some letters in the back as you go, but also check some websites out, follow up. All these groups are relatively small and need support. Also, so do the Rohingya groups, so do refugee groups. So, see if you can get involved. Think about how Save Darfur was. That was a huge movement. This deserves a lot more attention and a lot more action. Carolyn Maloney has signed on to Resolution 418 that was discussed. She did fairly quickly. Some of our folks out in Queens, Joe Crowley, he was part of drafting it. But Nadler hasn't. I met with his staff. They still haven't. A lot of our local Congress people have not signed on. What's the holdup? So if you guys can, just pick up the phone, contact them. They do want to hear from constituents. It's not the same as hearing from advocacy groups. So your voice does matter. Then I just wanted to thank the panel also. Everyone brings a lot. We have multiple dimensions here, and I think it was very powerful. And I want to acknowledge that it's painful in a personal way for people speaking about how it impacts your community, but also as a Muslim, I know that when I have to talk about all the bad things Muslims are doing here and there in the world, it's painful. So I want to acknowledge that it's painful, and I appreciate you bringing what you brought today too and engaging. I think it really brought a new dimension. So let's follow up. Let's try to think of what we can do. So thank you very much. Thank you.